para mí ver el auditorio tan lleno, que bueno, hay tal interés en escuchar al afamado filósofo Dupré. Acércate el micrófono un poquito de que aparezca. Bueno, mi nombre es Erika Torrens y el Laboratorio de Estudios Sociales de la Ciencia pues tiene el placer de haber invitado a este afamado filósofo, que antes de presentarlo propiamente tengo que hacer un aviso, porque en el cartel decía que iba a haber una introducción de Antonio Lascano, pero se disculpa muchísimo, tuvo otro evento casi a la misma hora en el Instituto de Biología, que no podía faltar, entonces, bueno, pues manda sus disculpas, pero bueno, está seguro que con la plática que dará el doctor Dupré, pues nos dejará satisfechos. La plática de hoy está titulada Beyond Neodarwinism y bueno, será impartida por el afamado John Dupré, quien es actualmente el director del Centro de Estudios de las Ciencias de la Vida y Genis de la Universidad de Exeter. Bueno, cuenta con un currículum en verdad espléndido. Recibió su doctorado en la Universidad de Cambridge en 1981. Posteriormente trabajó como investigadora adjunto en el John's College en Oxford por 2 años, antes de ocupar un puesto en el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Stanford, California, donde permaneció como profesor titular hasta 1996. Al año siguiente regresó a Inglaterra, donde ocupó primero el puesto de profesor titular en el Birkbeck College en la Universidad de Londres y finalmente como investigador principal en la Universidad de Exeter. Ha sido profesor visitante en la Universidad de Ámsterdam, de Tel Aviv, de Sudáfrica y de Oxford, entre muchas otras, y ha dirigido importantes proyectos financiados por el Consejo Europeo de Investigación. Actualmente es presidente electo de la Asociación de Filosofía de la Ciencia, de la cual será presidente entre 2021 y 2022. Pues bueno, básicamente la conferencia de hoy tratará sobre el estado actual de la síntesis moderna de la evolución y sobre todo sobre las razones por las que debería ser dejada de lado y reemplazada por una visión procesual sistemática de la vida, que es lo que les va a explicar a continuación. Entonces, bueno, la conferencia tendrá una duración de 1 hora y después tendremos tiempo para algunas preguntas. Desafortunadamente no habrá micrófono para la audiencia, entonces, bueno, todo aquel que quiera preguntar, ojalá lo pueda hacer en voz alta para que sobre todo los que están más atrás escuchen. So, thank you very much, John, for having accepted to give this lecture. Entonces le voy a dar la palabra al doctor John Dupré. Gracias.
Well, thank you, Erica, for that very nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always a wonderful place to visit. I need to talk close to this too. Okay. See how I can do this. Okay. So, today, as the title says, I'm going to talk about Neo-Darwinism and beyond. Here's an overview of what I want to talk about. So I'll say something about what I mean by Neo-Darwinism. And then I'll talk about various developments in biology generally and evolutionary thinking in particular that make this perspective on evolution increasingly problematic. And so I guess one issue in the background is that a lot of people will say this is just a gradual development of a theory over time, there's nothing particularly exciting going on. But as some of you will know, the debate that it causes is extraordinarily heated and causes all kinds of excitement. So I hope to give some idea, or at least some ideas of why that might be. And I suppose what I offer at the end is supposed to be, I don't think it'll be a resolution because the topic is so heated, but at least an account of why I think the neo-Darwinist theory remains so attractive, and also why I think it's in many respects mistaken. Okay, so let me start off by saying something about what I mean by Neo-Darwinism. And I also call it the hardened modern synthesis. Many of you will probably be familiar with the idea of the modern synthesis. This is the reconciliation in the 1930s, 1940s between Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian genetics. And this ended or at least produced some resolution of some very heated debates at the time, and I think was widely seen as providing a really strong way forward for biology. And much of what I describe in Neo-Darwinism is simply the continuation of this modern synthesis. The idea that the really core topic, the core idea in evolution was the selection, the natural selection of small genetic changes. And that these small genetic changes could add up to the enormous changes that one sees in the evolutionary record. And, sorry, I have to look back because there's too much text on this screen and I can't read it on the computer. So natural selection in this view, in the current view, the view which I call it hardened because I think that when the modern synthesis was introduced, it was still part of a more pluralistic view, indeed a pluralistic view which would have appealed to Darwin, who was always very open to multiple processes, multiple causes. But nowadays, natural selection is taken to be overwhelmingly the cause of evolutionary change, and through small genetic mutations. And the inheritance that passes through evolutionary history is thought to be mediated entirely or almost entirely by nuclear DNA. So what I want to say, and obviously the argument of this talk, is this is actually a problematic perspective, and that is an obstacle more than a help to progress in evolutionary theory. And I mention Richard Dawkins on the slide because I imagine many people will have read some of Richard Dawkins' work, perhaps his famous book in 1976, The Selfish Gene. Well, I mean, of course, Dawkins is a popularizer of the view rather than the originator of the view, but he is a wonderfully articulate spokesperson for it, and his account of what I mean by the hardened modern synthesis is exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so here are some things that I believe that begin to make the whole view much more problematic. And in particular, I think the idea that natural selection is really the only cause of evolutionary change is becoming problematic. I think it's well established that there are many ways in which changes are inherited through evolutionary time. And I also think one of the ideas in the modern synthesis, by virtue of the absolute overriding importance of natural selection, is that evolution is always a competitive process. And I think we're beginning to understand now that it's also a very cooperative process. And this fourth point is, I hope, looks sort of innocent, but certainly isn't, because if there's one thing that really infuriates devoted neo-Darwinists, it's the idea that there might be inheritance of acquired characteristics, so-called Lamarckism. It's the ultimate heresy, but nevertheless may well be true. And also, in addition to these small genetic changes, I want to suggest there are many sources of evolutionary novelty. And this is a crucial point, and I've highlighted my last little parenthesis there, because this, I think, is a widely neglected but obvious fact. Natural selection creates nothing. Natural selection selects. It has to select from things that are there. So it doesn't create anything. It only selects. And I think if you read, say, Richard Dawkins' classic works, you can easily get the impression that natural selection is this wonderfully creative thing. And of course, this builds on a whole network of assumptions that there's always almost infinite amount of genetic change that will produce almost any imaginary state of the organism that is being created, and somehow natural selection crafts these ideal types. Well, it could be true that anything can come about because there's so much genetic possibility and so on, but natural selection doesn't make it. The little genetic changes might make it, but natural selection doesn't. Okay, so just going through some of these points. Inheritance isn't only genetic. There's a classic book here by Eva Jablonka and Marion Lamb, which goes through all this in a lot of detail, and what I've listed there are the varieties of inheritance that are now perfectly well established as sources of evolutionary change. So, of course, we have the genetic, we have the epigenetic, which I'll talk about a little, and I'll talk about all of these. And crucially, I want to say all of these kinds of change can be inheritable. And if they're inheritable, then they can form the basis of evolutionary change. So, epigenetic inheritance. This is a very popular topic nowadays. Epigenetic just means, so I don't contradict what I put there, molecular causes of gene expression other than the sequence of DNA in the nucleus. The sequence of DNA in the nucleus is the thing that Neodarwinists think sort of explains everything, but epigenetics shows that it doesn't. There are various well-established molecular activities that are epigenetic. So there's most familiar probably are the methylations of DNA, actually also other things that happens to DNA, modifications of the structure that the DNA rests on, the histones that form a skeleton that the DNA sits on, and also increasingly recently an interest in very small RNAs that sit around in the cell, interacting with the behavior of the nucleus. Now, one of the crucial things that causes all the interest in epigenetics is that the environment induces many epigenetic changes in the organism. And, of course, the really scary possibility here is the environment could induce adaptive changes in the organism. And if that were true and they were inheritable, we have a totally Lamarckian process of adaptive evolution. Now, this is controversial for scientific reasons as well as ideological ones, but it's certainly a very real possibility at this point. We also have all kinds of inheritance, often called cultural, but also a special case of that I won't separate today, symbolic. And there's no question that cultural inheritance systems are really important to a lot of species. And I just focus the mind to give one example. This is the nut cracking technology in chimpanzees, which has been very well studied. Here's a picture, I don't know how well you can see that, but it contains all the things that you would expect if this was a technology learnt, passed on laterally, not horizontally, not only horizontally, to other populations of chimpanzees, which obviously they interact with one another, they see what other groups are doing, and then they start to do them. And so you can see that, if the nearby group is cracking nuts, you're more likely to crack nuts, and so on. And there are places where the practice hasn't spread at all. So this is something that's spreading horizontally and then being passed down vertically from generation to generation. And of course, it's clearly adaptive. At least, it's actually, you can study that. It has been studied. It's a good idea to have a technology for cracking nuts if you're a chimpanzee. And the technology spreads because it's adaptive. If it didn't look a good idea to other chimpanzees, they probably wouldn't copy it so commonly. So here we have just a classic example of a cultural innovation, adaptive, and that spreads both laterally and vertically. There are many such examples. They're transmitted sometimes through what obviously look like processes of teaching and learning, more often through what looks like simple imitation. But they're known in many different kinds of species of animal, at least. And of course, there are multiple human examples. I mean, if I'd done a map of religions or something, it would have certainly shown similar kinds of patterns of transmission horizontally and vertically. Again, this is a case of inheritable, acquired, adaptive characteristics, which are kind of a rather controversial thing, but they're not controversial in this case. They happen. Okay, now there is a response to this that neo-Darwinists tend to have, particularly in the case of epigenetics, that the idea that these things are not very stable, they don't last very long, so in the grand scheme of evolutionary history, they don't matter very much. And of course, the question then is, how long is long enough? If you'll excuse my sort of banging on about Richard Dawkins, he has a chapter in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, called Immortal Coils, describing DNA as immortal. But this is a very strange idea. DNA is, of course, not immortal. I won't get into religion here, but nothing on the, in the terrestrial sphere is immortal. DNA no more than anything else. And of course, the whole thing is the explanation of change. And so how long does something have to remain the same to change, to be... and I think just to prefigure something that I hope will come out later, I mean, one of the attractions of this is somehow the idea that change is difficult to explain, and you have to change it in terms of some kind of reorganization of things that don't change. I'll come back to that idea. But I just want to mention one other idea about that's crucial about epigenetics. There's all kinds of debate about how long epigenetic changes are inherited across generations. And there's clear evidence that they are, to some degree, sometimes inherited with the cell as modifications to the DNA. But this isn't the only way you could have long-term transmission of epigenetics. And actually, the classic example that people discuss most in epigenetics is a perfect example of this. And this is the case studied by Michael Meany and associates, in which mother rats lick baby rats in proper ways. And if they do lots of licking, the rats become kind of calm and easygoing. And if they don't get licked much, they're very nervous and uncomfortable. Now, you might well think that that's a rather good thing, because if the mother rat is so busy worrying about a dangerous environment, she won't do much licking. And it's a good thing if the environment is dangerous to be nervous and aware of things happening. But at any rate, whether or not that explanation is true, if the baby rats haven't been licked properly, they will be very nervous and anxious, and they won't lick their babies properly. So actually an inheritance process that passes through the behavior that induces the epigenetic changes is a possible long-term process that keeps recreating the change in the organism. Okay, yeah. So moving on to another aspect of the neo-Darwinist view, sources of selectable novelty are certainly not limited to small nuclear mutations. Now, one way in which this is true is that evolutionary theory now is pretty much committed to what is often called multi-level selection. Genes can be selected, but organisms can also be selected, and even groups of organisms can be selected. But this tends not to bother neo-Darwinists because they have a kind of device in the toolbox that takes care of this, which is a distinction you find in Dawkins between vehicles and replicators, elsewhere as interactors and replicators. So what it says is yes, what do genes do? They make these big vehicles, as Dawkins puts them, that then go and interact with one another, and according to how good they are at interacting with one another, the genes that made them do it get selected. So perhaps on the face of it, if that distinction is solid enough and only genes replicate, then we don't have to worry about this. A more interesting, I think it's very interesting, but a more problematic issue is plasticity, which I will talk more about. But I thought I would also mention that this is a long-standing debate, and one of the classic sources for questioning this small mutation thing is Richard Goldschmidt's lovely concept of the hopeful monster, that sometimes one of the arguments that neo-Darwinists use is you can't have big changes because organisms are perfectly adapted or nearly perfectly adapted, and if you move them a long way from where they are with a big change, then they'd be dead very quickly. Now, of course, this is just it's just a hypothesis. It could be true, but if you get lots of big changes, maybe something wonderful, the hopeful monster, always thinking that the wings it grew on its back will actually be useful, whereas in fact they're only 2 feet long and you're a pig, and really it's just not going to work. But nevertheless, maybe you're only much smaller and you grow these wings. They'll be absolutely wonderful. Your offspring will cover the earth. So it's just a theoretical and practical and empirical debate how big these these things can be. Much more contemporary context in which this is more seriously debated is EVO-DEVO, evolutionary developmental biology, which focuses a lot on particular genes that can encourage big changes, and in particular genes that affect regulatory genes that may actually, in very significant ways, produce new architectures or new proportions of parts that change an organism very substantially. This is a huge topic, and I think I'll just mention it in passing here. The other thing that I want to talk much more about is symbiosis or symbiogenesis. Symbiogenesis often is used just to refer to a famous set of cases, or even maybe just 1 or 2 cases of that people will know from the work of Lynn Margulis, of the origin of the eukaryotic cell as the absorption of one cell by another, creating a cooperative whole. This may be something that happens much more, but what happens all the time is just symbiosis, that organisms are more and more committed to cooperating together to produce wholes that are greater than the sums of the parts. I probably won't talk about holobionts here, but it's a hot topic that you can look up. But the idea is just that these cooperative wholes between different organisms could be actually units of selection in their own right. And this leads me, I guess, to one of my general theses, that one of the things that the kind of neo-Darwinian legacy obscures is the importance of cooperation in evolution. In reality, biological systems depend always, almost invariably, on some degree of cooperation. This can be cooperation between members of a species. You think of social insects or something, which are massively cooperative systems of organisms, to the extent that sometimes it's supposed that they're just really one organism, superorganism, but also, as I mentioned, this question of symbiosis, the fact that organisms depend on organisms of other kinds for their continued survival and existence. Okay, so just few examples that I expect many examples will be familiar to you, and I guess the most familiar to everyone is the increasing awareness of the human symbiosis, the fact that we as humans depend for our healthy existence on a myriad, trillions of bacteria that coexist with us. The exact degree of cooperation and how many of them are cooperating, and whether some of them are just hanging on, and other issues like maybe the role of viruses is something that needs to be greatly explored here. But these are debates within a move that is, I think, is not going to go away. That symbiosis actually is characteristic of us, but it's characteristic of organisms generally. Another, kind of absolutely classic case is the extent to which plants depend on symbiosis with fungi and actually communities of bacteria that interact with the fungi. And then there are some, I probably won't, but there are some nice stories about insects and the symbionts they have to have. One of the interesting things about those cases is that many of those are obligate symbionts that are actually passed in the maternal egg to the offspring. So they've actually become part of the inherited system of the organism. Okay. So the other topic I said I would pick up, phenotypic plasticity. And here again was a classic book that everybody has on their shelves in my neck of the woods, and few people read because it's enormously long. But it's a wonderful book to dip into and find examples of this phenomenon. The classic picture, I mustn't keep beating up on him, but you find in Dawkins is that the organism is kind of encoded in the genome. When you have a certain sequence of genes, it somehow generates an organism. But actually the process of generating an organism is enormously flexible and adaptive to the environment. So, I'll give you some more examples, but there's also a crucial point that there are all kinds of hypotheses about how, particularly if the environment changes in a way that generations of organisms respond to it through their plastic developmental processes, these will gradually get built in, even assimilated genetically, so eventually these changes just come about in the normal course of things. Of course, this could just be understood as the selection of organisms that more naturally produce that particular plastic variation. But then the environment is acting on the organism directly to produce adaptive change. And that ugly name of Lamarck kind of hovers in the background once more. Okay, I just want to say a little bit more about this. I like to think that you can sort of associate kinds of plasticity with major groupings of organisms, though this is very rough. And of course, just to show that, I give an example of morphological plasticity in an animal. This is a dog that doesn't have front legs, so it learns to walk on two legs. And as it does so, it develops a quite characteristically, distinctively different bone structure. Its hips will develop differently, and so on, so that it can become quite good at walking on two legs. But other examples of this are the kind of very familiar phenotypic. That was a detour. Bacteria have this wonderful plasticity of metabolic plasticity, of creating adaptive chemistry, essentially by coming together in communities that use the resources, the different chemical resources, to process more or less any substrate that provides available energy. Plants, as any gardeners among you will know, will take very different shapes according to the light, the space, what other plants are around. And animals will learn to behave in ways, as we've already seen in an earlier case. All of these are ways in which novelty comes about through adaptive response to the environment. Okay. One other thing I should talk about, and again, maybe this is something I haven't explicitly talked about. The Neo-Darwinian model is a passive one. Evolution is something that just passively selects among whatever's out there happening. But organisms don't just passively respond to the environment. Indeed, organisms typically create environments to which they're adapted. And this is a widespread phenomenon, and historians here will be familiar with what may be the most classic example of this, Darwin's work on earthworms, and the way in which what is more or less still an aquatic organism lives in soil by changing the soil, by bringing organic matter, leaves and things into the soil that helps to maintain the wetness of the soil and allows these organisms to live in it. But of course, other classic examples are beaver dams, which change the whole landscape around them, and perhaps the most extreme of all, ourselves. We create, this lecture theatre didn't just happen to be there, and we decided we evolved genes that would encourage us to come in here and listen to lectures. We created the environment, the technology, and so on, so we could come and, maybe not on this occasion, but on some occasions, come and learn things that will be useful to us going around and surviving in the world. Okay, so is all this just, and this is the question I raised early on, is this just kind of gradual development of a core theory that is just progressing calmly along the way theories do? And I guess, as I said at the beginning, if this is true, then the thing that's so puzzling is that it should be so heated. People should care so much about these changes. And of course, in some ways, this is an unanswerable question. What's a minor change? What's a major change? What's an overturned paradigm? I think, just I mentioned, these concepts from the history of philosophy of science. The one that works best for me is from Imre Lakatos, the idea of a degenerating research paradigm. That constantly we have these changes happening to the theory, and people will always say, yeah, that doesn't really make a lot of difference. That's really just still selection of genes. They're just more complicated ways in which the genes are affected by the processes and so on. But in a way, one might argue that even this term, and I would, extended synthesis is a way of promoting this gradualist view and ignoring the fact that really this is a perspective that is more harmful than helpful at this point in time. So that's basically the first half or so of my talk, in which I wanted to just lay out these challenges, these problems that have come, forced this modification of the synthesis. But now I want to offer, I guess, a much more eccentric but unusual account of what I think is really underlying it, or at least what we need to change to get a really fresh perspective that makes all these new ideas, new processes, or newly discovered processes fit in much more smoothly with a general picture. And as it says on the slide, what I offer in this regard is a process view. So my argument is, if I haven't made it sufficiently, that we need a different metaphysical framework. And I'm told, I was talking to Erica about this, and she said metaphysics tends to mean kind of mysterious, sort of supernatural things. And I see it, certainly I'm very familiar in most bookshops I go to at home. The metaphysics section has the wisdom of the Orient and the, kind of how to get outside your body and stuff like that. I hope many of you will know that when I talk about metaphysics, I don't mean that. I mean a really broad general view of what's happening, what's going on. And I think that we need a different one from the one that's dominant, at least in the philosophical traditions that I know best. And so here's the cash value. I think the hardened modern synthesis reflects a mechanistic metaphysics, a metaphysics that, well, I'll say more about this, but a metaphysics that in biology was greatly encouraged by the extraordinary progress that happened in molecular biology with the discovery of the structure of DNA. And there's actually, I mean, in a more historical vein, it's very interesting that the sorts of ideas I'm talking about, a process view of biology, was developing in very interesting ways. People like C.H. Waddington in the first half of the 20th century, and then it all kind of faded away. And I think it's not too simplistic to say it faded away, because a mechanistic story about life was emerging through the breakthrough with DNA that was enormously productive and successful, and rightly people focused a lot of attention, but as often happens, I think this led, eventually started to run out of steam because it was founded on what ultimately I say is the wrong metaphysics, the wrong general picture of what life is. So here's my history of philosophy in 2 slides. In Western philosophy, the philosophy I learned starts with the pre-Socratics, and these people had remarkably opposing views. So, 2 absolutely contradictory views, you might think. Parmenides, change is an illusion. There is no change at all. Heraclitus, there's nothing but change. There is no stability, there's just change. Now, I guess, in a way, Parmenides, it seems a little unfair because it's so obviously false as it stands, because, we see change every day. So, but to make it make sense, what I think we have to understand is that what underlies this is the idea that what fundamentally exists are eternal, unchanging things. And all that happens is that they get restructured, they get rearranged in relation to one another. So they form somewhat stable, longer-term structures, like atoms and molecules. But, well, atoms, of course, were the unchanging things until we started cutting them up. But basically, this seems to me as the proper, as the Parmenidean view. Nothing is interesting or important other than the underlying impermanent things, and then we look at the way these are built up into structures and mechanisms. Mechanisms are the way these structures of atoms interact with one another to make the sort of big, sort of changing things that we see in the world. Second slide moves on nearly 2 centuries, and basically the Parmenides and his mates won. The scientific revolution was largely based on this view of the world. The view of the world is made of these permanent atoms that rearrange their relations to one another. And again, as I suggested with the kind of DNA revolution, this was, of course, enormously successful, but I want to say fundamentally wrong. And in the long run, I mean, it's perhaps unfair to say it was a disaster for the future of biology because we've come a long way. But in the end, it was a drag on the future of biology because it's just the wrong picture, the wrong metaphysics. So a little bit more the dominant mechanistic worldview. Everything is basically to be explained bottom up, wholes explained in terms of their parts. And I want to say this is often great methodology, but bad metaphysics. Mechanistic models, I want to say, and here I'm saying this is not the view that I'm describing, should always be seen as abstractions from the underlying processes. And I hope this will come a little clearer. So if you take the mechanistic models that we develop in science as real, how things ultimately are, they suggest a hierarchy of static things. The really static ones at the bottom, and then the fairly static ones as they're made up into stable structures, and then maybe less static ones as these produce very complex structures like us. And again, this is perhaps a bit hypothetical, but it seems to me that Neo-Darwinism draws a lot of appeal from the fact that it is a classically mechanistic bottom-up picture. Really, again, or in the extreme versions of it, the only thing that really has any explanatory significance are the genes, or the bits of DNA. Everything else is explained by them, both the development of the organism and the evolution of organisms. So it's a classically mechanistic view in even this sort of ancient Democritean sense. But now, so here's the contrast I want to make with this bad metaphysics and my good metaphysics. So I think we should see the world not as composed of these things, structures of things, but as indeed Heraclitus said, as processes. One of the crucial things is to understand that processes don't just mean, processes can be very stable. And so I give these two examples as sort of, to just kind of harden ideas. You might think a mountain was a really stable thing. Now, of course, in reality, that's just a matter of time scale, because if you were looking at a large enough scale, it's just part of the geological processes that happen on our planet. But still, when you climb up of the afternoon, you hope that it's very stable. But now here's a very stable phenomenon, the great red spot on the surface of Jupiter. But this is completely processed. It's totally dynamic. It's a whirlpool. It's held in place and has been for several centuries at least by winds that circulate around it, maintaining roughly the same shape. Of course, not exactly the same shape, but the phenomenon has been there for, as they say, centuries. But it only exists because stuff is happening that makes it continue to exist. And so what we have is, I call it an individual because it's stable over time, but it's dynamically stabilized. If everything stopped moving, it would stop existing pretty much instantaneously. Okay, and here are some sort of verbal summaries of what I've been trying to get at. But now, the bit in green is the kind of cash value of this. And this is where I think this really, what I think is the most important payoff of this way of thinking for how we should do or think about doing science. A world of things has traditionally been one in which we try and explain why things change. Now, of course, it's good to explain why things change, but obviously, but it ignores what I think is certainly in biology is much more fundamental, which is what for a process, the first question you ask is how it stays the same, why it stays the same, how all these movements that sustain it do indeed maintain a constant structure with more or less constant properties. So, a quote from the philosopher Nicholas Rescher, as process ontologists see it, enduring things are never more than patterns of stability in a sea of process, just like the great red spot, only a lot more complicated. For process philosophy, what a thing is consists in what it does. And of course, this also means, since stabilization is never perfect, some change is just always expected. You expect a process to be changing in all kinds of ways, but you also, if it's a stable process or stable enough, then there should also be processes that explain how it remains that stability. Now, I realize when I say this, one of the things that I would like to have time to say more about, but don't, is of course there are many different kinds of processes. So, like metabolic processes that sustain a human life are a different kind of process from the human life that they sustain. But still, I want to say both of these are best understood as processes. Some processes have a trajectory, some are more or less stable, some are just a mess. So there's much to be said about this, but I just want to introduce the basic idea of a very different kind of world from the one that scientists often assume. I've got these coming up that. Here's how I think the biological world should look to a process philosophy. We have this hierarchy, but it's not a hierarchy of things that just make things on the next level up. It's a hierarchy where at each level we have stable systems that are stable both because of what happens, the processes of interactions between their parts, but also the way they are interacted on by the larger context they're in. So, easiest example here would be, say, the heart. We all know lots of stuff has to go on in the heart for it to work properly. There has to be lots of chemicals, tissues, and things interacting in the right way. But we also know a heart has to be embedded in a body for it to carry on stably working the way it does. We know we're all familiar. We have to move our bodies around and exercise in order to have healthy hearts. And of course, the body, even if we're not healthy, if we're alive, the body is pumping blood, nutrients, oxygen, and all of these things through it. So it is a stable system, both because of its parts and because of the whole it's part of. Okay, so we have this two-way causation between processes at these different time scales. He said this, I hope it's sort of obvious. Organisms are processes. There are actually several kinds of processes which can give interesting questions about whether you always draw the boundaries around them in the same ways, because one of the things that process thinking tells you is that boundaries are quite hard to define. You have this interaction between different processes that's essential to those processes. Where does one begin and the other end? But at any rate, we know that in this case, two of them are the human again. We know that we're metabolic processes. We're constantly maintaining ourselves in thermal disequilibrium by taking in energy, mass from the environment and using it to maintain all kinds of chemical processes, trillions of interactions every second. Crucially, we are developmental processes. Organisms are cycles of development that are different at different times as they pass through different stages in the life cycle, and they're cooperative processes. As I said before, organisms are sustained by their interactions with all kinds of other organisms. So, processual through and through. The last point is particularly crucial in making the argument because, things, very hard to understand things being entangled, but the entanglement of processes is one of the main ways that they're sustained. And if you give examples of very familiar kinds of processy looking things, they don't have very sharp boundaries. This picture speaks for itself, I suppose. You think about what are the parts of a river system, like a delta? When does a river become a lake? When does how many tributaries are there? When's a tributary a river? And all of these things are just abstractions from the process to give us stable things within it in many different ways. Okay, finally, bringing all this back to evolution. How should we think of the metaphysics of evolution? So what evolves? Now, of course, we all know organisms don't evolve. What evolves are lineages of organisms. Evolution happens if within a lineage the distribution of properties at one time is different from the distribution of properties at another time. So the properties of the organisms in the lineage are different from what they were before. But change in individual organisms isn't evolution. So what does this? The traditional answer has been species. And I think it's a good answer. It's technically not quite right. Some species consist of a lot of isolated populations that may or may not be evolving together. And a bigger problem for another time, some kinds of organisms don't really form species at all. But actually, I can fit this into the story. I may gesture to it if I have time. But now let's just talk about species as the thing that evolve, their lineages, and so George Gaylord Simpson, a lineage is an ancestral descendant sequence of populations evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role. It's a good standard. idea. So what is a species? Philosophers of biology among you, like myself, will, and if you're as old as I am, you will know one of the biggest issues, this has been one of the biggest issues in the philosophy of biology. And probably, one of the most famous theses in the subject has been the view of David Hull and Michael Gieslin that rather than think of species as ways of classifying organisms, they're ways of picking out individuals, individual lineages. And my own view is actually we need both views of species, but of course they won't exactly coincide. But that's a story for another time, which I've told, so I give it one of only 2 self-citations. So the crucial point, of course, for me, that deals with, I think, immediately dismisses a great many objections that have been made to this view, is to realize they're individuals, but not individual things, but individual processes. And evolution is just the change within these lineage processes. So that's my metaphysics of evolution. So species, like organisms, are individual processes. This, of course, explains why it's no problem that they have discontinuous parts. Many processes have discontinuous parts. I mean, another classic example is a battle. I don't know whether the space between 2 fighting soldiers is part of the process of a battle, but it really probably isn't. It's just all these distributed individuals killing one another. The species have ambiguous boundaries. This has been one of the things that's, made, I think, this quite problematic for people, is realizing that, as well as this intertwining of species I've talked about, this hybridization, and recently we've become much more aware of lateral gene transfer. All of these things are at least problems for seeing species as traditional thing-like individual objects, but no problem at all for seeing them as individual processes. You don't have to expect any properties to be continuous throughout their history. So what are they? It says organisms, these processes of self-organization, self-maintenance, are species essentially the same things. And here I go back to David Hull, who perhaps was really a process ontologist, according to some people I talked to. So essentially, what's he say? Most organisms exhibit more internal organization than most species, but this difference is of degree, not of kind. Most species do not exhibit the internal organism common in vertebrate organisms, but the same can be said for plants. Most plants don't have the same internal organism as vertebrate animals. So crucially, organization of a process is a matter of degree. Some are more organized than others. I mean, a cloud is a process that's very disorganized and very unstable, for example. But like many individual organisms, perhaps like all individual organisms, to some important degree, species really do construct their individuality, do stuff happens around, there are explanations of their stability at least. So, what stabilizes a species? And here, I think the crucial answer is natural selection. I think, and I actually want to argue, though I couldn't do that today, that really this is the fundamental importance of natural selection in evolution. And it's very important. I'm not dismissing natural selection as not terribly significant. I think it's fundamental to the stabilization of lineage processes. It may actually, I think, and of course this is the bit that will get me into vast trouble in some quarters, it may be much less important as an explanation of change. And indeed, I'm sort of tempted to a view in which these processes are stabilized and just wander around. And of course, crucially, where they can wander, and this is because they're being stabilized by natural selection, is always constrained by their conditions of existence. And that's a very hard constraint, as people have realized in the history of biology. So a process that wanders around within the space in which it can survive and stays there through natural selection. Of course, what you don't get is the rather strange idea in Neodarwinism, I haven't actually mentioned yet, but of optimization. Some of the idea that the best possible way of being in whatever externally existing space they find themselves in. But this is a crazy idea. I mean, what's the best? Why should they be the best? It's hard enough to stay alive without having to be the best possible, and that seems to me is what species do. And of course, there are other aspects to the stability of a species. A crucial one, as I said, and again, this idea of just optimizing yourself in a given context is you create the context. One of the ways you stay within the conditions of existence is constantly manipulating the conditions of existence by constructing your niche. And finally, of course, reproduction of members of the species. And then, of course, this brings in all the many processes that I talked about in the context of extended inheritance. All of these are processes that keep contributing to the production of new members of the species. Now, I'll just start to wrap up now. There are many issues outstanding from all of this. And one of the most interesting, I think, is to what extent species, I've talked about, there are things that stabilize them, to what extent they really are discrete, integrated processes, i.e. individual processes, rather than just abstractions from the history of life of particular groups that we just choose to look at. What are the integrating, individualizing processes? And I think the sort of secret to understanding this is to realize that species are themselves a highly diverse group of phenomena. And I said that in the case of bacteria, it's very questionable whether there are any species. So it may well be that the only divisions that you can find in species are lines drawn in bacteria, are lines drawn by natural selection, or better, by the conditions of existence that mean only certain combinations of genetic resources exist in the bacterial world. And that's all there is to be said. And there are many different ways you could draw that, because there are many different ways of describing the bacteria. But what you have as you move through evolution to highly complex metazoans like ourselves is ever more integration of the process into a standardly reproduced or replicated form, and doing this through processes that draw boundaries around the organism and draw boundaries that differentiate it from other kinds of organisms. And of course, famously in this course, sexual reproduction is a device that cements boundaries between different kinds of organisms, that builds barriers between them. And as species become more individual-like, more integrated through these various processes, more kinds of evolutionary change come possible. Bacteria don't do cultural evolution, I'm pretty sure, because to do cultural evolution requires setting up all kinds of relations between the members of the species that enable them to interact in particular ways. And of course, again, it isn't exactly true that bacteria don't cooperate. They come together to form these consortia, biofilms and things like that. But these are very transitory, and it's very debated whether they are evolutionary individuals or just all kinds of temporary coalescences of contributors to a process. And I guess a final question that I really will just mention is, if lineages are individuals, then we should start thinking about distinctive properties of those individuals. And the one that immediately comes to mind, of course, is a topic that is quite popular nowadays in evolution, evolvability. So evolvability is the sort of thing that one might see evolving in a lineage that was doing a good job of maintaining its stability and its integration. So I finally finish. I want to say all the main theses of Neo-Darwinism have been shown to be problematic, and not just philosophically, have been empirically shown to be by phenomena that are very well documented. And so you wonder why the view remains attractive. Well, of course, one thing is natural selection still looks a really cool idea, and I think it is a really cool idea, so that's all right. But I want to suggest that a big part of its real attraction is that people think of, kind of, it's resisting mystical things like Lamarckian, metaphysical in the other sense, in those bookshops. But of course, what I want to suggest is there's nothing funny, spooky, or anything about a process view of evolution where lineages are entities that have all kinds of ways of changing over time that we can call evolutionary. And I think that we can then get away from the kind of mutual support between a bad metaphysics and an outdated theory. And I said I give 2 self-citations. Oh, what's that say? Oh, there's something here. Oh, the battery is agotando. Okay. Right. So then it won't let me do... Oh, the next slide. Sorry about that. Now? Yes. Fortunately, we've got to the end. Just a little with an advertisement. If I've intrigued you at all with the process view of life, I'd advertise this book, and I feel very good about doing that because it's free. It's open access, courtesy of my soon-to-be former friends in the European Union. But there it is, and it has all kinds of explorations of how to do biology in a proper Heraclitean way. And with that, I will.
Wonderful and enlightening talk. So now we have time for questions. Ahora tenemos una media hora para preguntas. No sé quién quiere empezar.
Yeah, I need them.
Someone. Francisco.
Hello, John.
Hello.
Well, perhaps I should start by saying that in a few weeks' time, Jan Nicholson will be here, and it's really great that you have given this introduction to what we will continue to talk about. And so I have many questions, but I will only formulate one, which is related to the process ontology, in your terms, and cultural evolution. So you mentioned cultural evolution several times, but I don't think you really engaged in the question of the applicability of your framework to what cultural evolution is, but also other sorts of specialists, like linguists or archaeologists, study as cultural processes of the entities that they deal with. So probably the hardest example is language. Right? But before asking you, how do you think your view or your framework applies to language? You want to mention something that probably many people in the room knows. Many historical linguists today claim that you can do phylogenetics in language, right? Which in principle entails certain ontological assumptions about what languages are. And I think this, I didn't think about this before looking at the way you treated the issue of species and systematics. But this bit that I had not heard you talking about before makes me think that you have perhaps a specific interest in applying the applicability of your framework to those issues that are dealt with mostly in physiological surveys. So
I mean, that was very interesting. I'm not entirely sure I know what the question exactly is. I mean, I certainly, I mean, I think language is a really important aspect of the human species. It's a process that affects the evolution, for example, by facilitating kinds of cooperation that are unique to our species. I mean, the level of cooperation, which I often like to think of in terms of the division of labor, which is absolutely unique to humans, depends on language. Language is a locally diverse, I mean, diverse from place to other in very interesting ways. I mean, this is touching on a controversial set of issues that I really don't have a strong opinion about. I mean, whether there are languages or whether there are just idiolects in a Chomskyan style, which we can abstractly group together into local languages. But I don't see, I mean, all of that certainly I think fits, well, I mean, I guess the idea that there really aren't any languages, there's just people speaking to one another in ways that are responsive to how people speak in their environment, might fit rather nicely with a more processed view rather than a language as somehow real entities out there. Okay. I mean, I think there are lots of ways that one could move to a much more micro scale in our species and talk about the evolution of language within this framework. But I guess, so really, my problem with answering your question is I'm not sure what of all that to say, other than, yes, I certainly would recognize it as a...
So if I make an additional comment so that we can continue talking. The bigger question behind what I discussed has to do with what do we make of technology and artifacts in general? They are certainly evolving. What kind of evolutionary processes are going on? This is an area that is mostly unexplored, actually.
I've argued for a long time that technology is absolutely part of human evolution. I mean, an example I like is when I was young, human social structure was based almost entirely on physical proximity. The people you were interacting with were the people who were in the same immediate space, who could hear you make noises, like speech. Nowadays, I see much younger people going around whose social space is completely divorced from their physical space. They're talking to a group of individuals who might be scattered around the whole planet through a technology that everybody carries around in their pockets. I think that's a huge evolutionary change. It's a fundamental change happening in the way that we socially interact with one another and will change, I've no doubt, the way we cooperate with one another and so on. So I think technology is absolutely something we have evolved in this lineage and that has massive evolvability.
Hi, John. I would like you to say more about, you said that the mechanistic view is, as you say, bad ontology but good method or methodology. So I wonder if it happens, I mean, that if the bad approach to the process you're defending here, I mean, what would be a good methodology for a process view of life? I mean, maybe that might be.
I think that's a huge question, and I mean, and of course that's an evasive answer, but I think it's a reasonable evasive answer, at least in the sense that we've been doing mechanistic science for centuries. I think, it would be, if I were a better historian, I would have spent more time looking at differences in the way the very committed process ontologists like Waddington and the Cambridge, a theoretical biology group and so on, we're talking about how it affected their, actually, you mentioned Dan Nicholson's coming, he works very much on this historical period, so maybe he'll be able to have some insights into that. But, I mean, one of the problems is that what a process ontology recognizes is how integrated everything is, how multiply interdependent everything is. And that's very hard to study. Certain conceptions of systems biology are directed, I think, at trying to do that, though there's another school of systems biology which is just massive reductionism with big computers. But there are certainly systems biologists who are much more theoretically engaged with trying to think about systems top-down and bottom-up at the same time. And this may be a way forward. But of course, a possibility, which I have to confront, is that it may be that mechanism is the only workable methodology. I don't believe it, but it wouldn't change my view. It would just mean that, it would suggest that we were less able to get to reality than we thought. If reality is complex in ways that we really can't handle properly, except by abstracting bits. And of course, mechanism isn't just a bad idea given. I mean, mechanism, you can see why it works. Mechanisms work to the extent that the constituents of a mechanism you identify are stable over the time process of the activities you're interested in. So, I mean, it's not a mystery that you can do mechanistic science sometimes, but I guess it's just that we need to, I think, resist inferring the metaphysics from the methodology, at least to a degree.
¿Alguien más? Okay.
Well,
Thank you so much, John.
my pleasure. Thank you. Well, didn't inspire a lot of questions.